to our Navigating Through Volatility webinar series with Apex Inland Empire and sponsored by LMA Consulting Group. We're excited to be here today with our next webinar speaker to navigate through these trying times, and more importantly really is how do we come out the other side successfully and ready to go, because for sure when things come back, we need to be ready when it comes to manufacturing and supply chain. So with that said, I am going to introduce our speaker, which we've had before. So John Tulak. John is a international and general business and corporate attorney. He's been recognized in the Bar Register of Preeminent Attorneys as an expert in the field of international business law, and is annually listed as a leading lawyer in Los Angeles County and the Inland Empire. So John is versed in all areas of international law, including importing and exporting of goods, agency and distribution agreements, licensing, joint ventures, and infrastructure projects. John is absolutely an expert in all countries that are of prominence when it comes to manufacturing and supply chain. So China, Vietnam, Mexico, I don't know, we'll ask John about all sorts of places. India is coming up on the radar more and more these days, so we shall see what John has to say. So with that said, John, we really appreciate you doing this webinar. So maybe we can make it somewhat interactive, and if you have questions, I should have said this, if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A or the chat box, and I will ask John the questions as we go. And John, I'll ask you questions too, so we can make sure that we address all the areas that be of interest to manufacturing and supply chain. We have executives, we have professionals, we have students. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you for a general update, and then we'll just make it interactive and play it by ear. So thank you very much, John.
Terrific, and thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to participate in this again. I always look forward to doing that. I had every intention of being able to put some slides together for part of this, but I've been doing 12, 14-hour days literally for the last 2 weeks straight, dealing with issues in the supply chain arising out of coronavirus. And so you just get talking head me for this. No slides today.
No problem.
It is great. I did want to allow time for questions. So the nature of the presentation is such that we can do it interactively as we go throughout this. So as you see fit, Lisa, we'll adapt to what you want to do. So today I'm going to yank your supply chain. So heave ho, anchors away. We'll do that in just a little bit. But I wanted to start with what we're seeming to do at every Zoom or Skype meeting that I'm on is coronavirus update. Over 1 million confirmed cases around the world. We have deaths, and it brings to mind Joseph Stalin's infamous line, one death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic. And we can't afford to think that way on a personal, on a human level. On an economic level, as we look at impacts on systems and businesses and so on, we have to evaluate statistically. And so one of the things that we're seeing, and I'm using we here because I'm drawing on quite a few sources, including some that are not your everyday media reports, is that this is beginning to look a lot like earlier versions of this kind of a coronavirus, and it's actually beginning to start to look a little bit like our regular flus. And so let me give you some context about that. One of the things that's scary about this is we had no idea at the beginning how widespread it was and how deadly it could be. And so at the beginning, based on limited data, unfortunately, from China, some of which was false, we had some early modeling which projected some really severe worst case outcomes, especially in terms of number of deaths. And government agencies and national governments made decisions based on that. Now, further along into this, we have more data, a lot of it much better, And we're seeing that this is looking much like other types of strains. It's probably not going to be as deadly as originally anticipated, except for the ones who are the most vulnerable, as we've seen in Italy. The best example of where we're getting good hard data that this isn't so bad is Iceland, where they literally tested 5% of the population. Now, Iceland's a pretty small country, not a big population, and they're able to do that a lot more effectively than we could have done, even if we had gotten a better start on it here in the United States. But the lesson from Iceland is a very positive one, and it confirms something that a lot of other medical specialists were talking about, that this does not appear to be as serious as originally reported. Why then did we get all these false signs? Because for most people, the symptoms were 0 symptoms to mild symptoms. And so we had no idea how many people actually got this and how soon they actually got this. Again, data as it's coming in is now showing this came to the United States in December and January. It came prior to the Wuhan lockdown. And so this was already here, it's just that most people didn't know what they had. And we didn't know to be testing for it, or at least we missed the warning signs to be testing for it until way too late. So we've had a lot of overreaction. And so the optimism is we're going to have a couple of really, really rough weeks, maybe even a rough month, but we're going to be able to get through this. And it goes to the old saying in the computer science world of GIGO. GIGO stands for garbage in, garbage out. If we have bad assumptions or we make decisions based on bad data, we get bad decision making and bad results. And so we're going to have to work our way through some of that. It also means that once again we have, because we're dealing with something new, and something new is scarier than something old, we have misunderstood perhaps in some ways some of the risks. We accept close to 38,000 deaths every year on our nation's highways because we've gotten used to the idea of risk because we're used to driving automobiles and we're not willing to give that up. We're used to several 100,000 people dying of flu every year, and an even greater number dying from pneumonia. That's unfortunately part of our everyday lives. And every time that happens, there is loss in a family, in a community. But economically, we don't shut down the economy. So we're going to learn from this experience, I hope, and you're going to hear me come back to this at the end. We have an opportunity now as we're sheltering in place to be learning a lot about our own businesses and what we're doing and how we're doing things relative to the disruption that came from this rather unexpected event. And my advice is, let's take the time and learn from that and don't just hit the reset button, say, let's get back to business as usual. This is an opportunity to do better than business as usual when we get everybody back to work. So with that in mind, let's look at the supply chain aspects of all of this. And I'm reminded of a situation where there can be scarcity. And a general contractor goes to a lumber yard and he wants a rather large order of 2x4s. And the lumberyard guy says, okay, I can sell those to you at 18 cents a linear foot. And the general contractor says, that's outrageous. I went to your competitor down the street and he was going to sell them to me for 15 cents a linear foot, but he doesn't have any. He's out. And the lumberyard guy, without missing a beat, says, oh, that's nothing. When we're out, we sell them for 10 cents a linear foot. So when you don't have something, price doesn't matter very much. When you need something and somebody has it and somebody else doesn't, price could matter a lot. And so we're seeing that in terms of the pricing of some of the goods that are perceived to be scarce. We've certainly seen a perceived scarcity of toilet paper, and there is no scarcity of toilet paper. Price hasn't gone up because of it. Maybe there's a black market in toilet paper. I don't know about that. But to be more serious, in terms of things like respirator face masks and other things that hospitals are definitely looking for, there isn't a shortage. There is not a shortage of product from reputable manufacturers that make this stuff every day for a living. 3M is making 3 million face masks a day in their plant in Mexico. And those masks are coming into the United States. Where we see difficulty is a disconnect between supply and getting them to the places where they're most critically needed. That's a supply problem. That's a logistics problem. It is not a matter of lack of supply or scarcity. Test kits are being produced in great quantity. Abbott Labs is one. There are 2 or 3 others that have good field test kits that are being produced overseas. Those need to get to the places where they're critically needed the most. We also, of course, at a time like this, see fraud. And so we saw Italy make a massive order from disreputable companies in China, and they got a lot of bad face masks. We saw the same thing happen in Italy, where the purchase price was already paid. You saw perhaps the news in the LA Times, was I think yesterday's paper, Sunday's paper, Saturday's paper, that one of our unions here in California was prepared to arrange for a $39 million order, but they ended up backing out of it, fortunately, without any money passing, because it was not a legitimate supplier. And of course, any of us who are involved in this every day know you vet your manufacturers thoroughly before you commit to an order, particularly a massive one like that. And they didn't do that properly. So fortunately, that particular kind of fraud was averted. A couple more examples of this. Ventilators are in short supply, but ventilators are something that other manufacturers that are not routinely making them can convert capacity over and make that. And we're seeing that kind of thing happen, fortunately, being produced here in the United States. It's one area where we still have some resiliency, where the manufacturing capacity hasn't been outsourced primarily to China, and there's no capacity here. So that's an important lesson I think we should learn as well, is that we have to have, even at greater cost, the ability to produce things that are absolutely necessary in anticipation that global supply chains will not always be reliable, could break down totally, or could break down for significant periods of time. That disruption in time of need obviously could cause a great deal of harm. Forewarned is forearmed. We know, as sensible people, there's no lack of food and water. Our tap system works just fine. There's no need to stockpile on that. One of the interesting things in terms of demand, however, is that the fresh produce people are reporting that fresh produce sales are way, way down. Now that's pretty interesting to me. You have people sheltering in place, so they can't go to restaurants. So the restaurants have obviously cut down their orders because they're on life support just with takeout, maybe 10 to 20% maximum of what their usual volume of business might be. But people still have to eat, so if they're not going to restaurants, like they would always do in New York, you're gonna have to make meals at home. What are you using? Are you opening up the canned beans? Well, what you should be first using, because the canned beans can last on your shelf for a long time, assuming a worst case scenario, is you should either be putting on your face mask and going to the store, or putting in your online order, and you should be buying fresh produce. But that's not happening. So as a result, an unexpected byproduct of this is that the fresh produce people are now suffering. And so what we have here in a couple of respects is demand shock, some expected, some unexpected. That was certainly an unexpected one. Another unexpected one, but only in terms of timing, this is otherwise a foreseeable thing, is with respect to the price war that broke out between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And absolutely the worst possible timing in some ways, because as the rest of the world is trying to deal with coronavirus, we're now dealing with the ripple effect, the shock effect of the substantial reduction in the demand for oil. On the one hand, people aren't driving, people aren't flying, so you've got a demand shock there. At the same time that you're dropping the price dramatically because of this price war, which would normally boost the demand for this. And then we're still producing like crazy in our own oil patch, and there's no place to sell that right now. So we have a classic contango. We expect prices to go up later. And where do we put this stuff? In a matter of 3 weeks, the existing production that still has to flow through is going to fill up all of our storage and every available ship that can be used for storage that isn't shipping something somewhere else. And then now what?
Well, so what is that answer, John? I mean, if so within 3 weeks, we're at that 3 week point, aren't we?
No, it's coming though up rapidly. What happens is something has to give on that. I mean, normally we would be ecstatic about this kind of a price war unless we were in the oil patch here in the United States. Here we have a depleting resource, oil, and we've got parties that are not really our friends. Saudi Arabia is an ally, but they're not really a friendly ally. Russia has proven itself to be an adversary to this day. And so here are two major suppliers, and they're trying to tell us, look, we'll sell you our oil, our most valuable asset, at this cut rate price. Why wouldn't we buy it? You know, again, this is going to mean a shakeout in the oil patch, but you know, a lot of this production was ill-advised. Companies over-leveraged, way too much debt. They shouldn't have been in business anyhow. We should not have gone to the highest level of production that the United States has ever achieved in oil. And so this has happened before. We've had this kind of thing in the oil patch where there's been a shakeout. And so we're going to have another shakeout. It's going to be a rough one for some of our, especially the smaller oil companies that have done this. And so there'll be a time of consolidation. So we'll end up with some much stronger oil companies as a result of it. But where we would otherwise be able to take advantage of this, the lack of demand is making a lot of this opportunity kind of meaningless.
Very good. So now let's start and go through some of the countries. You know, since a lot of us, from a logistics point of view, we get a lot of products from China. So how are things in China now, do you think? And how can we rely upon their reporting, or, you know, like how close to back are they? And what do you think will happen in the future? So a lot of questions, but what do you think about China first?
It always comes back to China. Here in more ways than one, because obviously the coronavirus started in China. You know, calling it the China virus or the Wuhan virus or the nasty virus, doesn't matter what name we put on it. The fact of the matter is, the reality is, that's where it started. And China's got to live with that. We also have to live with the fact, it has to live with the fact that public opinion here and elsewhere around the world is moving strongly against China for how it handled this, especially since they've tried to recast all of this as, you know, a courageous effort by China to have contained something that our U.S. military actually created. I mean, that's the current story, is that this actually was originated by the United States military. It got loose, and China was the victim, and then China solved that problem. I don't know how that even plays in terms of local consumption inside of China. But it ain't playing here, obviously. The American people are not happy with China for a lot of reasons. And it's not playing well around the rest of the world, particularly the countries that are dependent on China through the Belt and Road Initiative. They're beginning to see where all the bad strings have been attached to this. They're seeing that there's been a lot of manipulation, and it's made them rightfully suspicious of China and China's intentions. So that's one of the backfires of this in terms of what's going on in China. We still know really very little about actual numbers in China, what the true impact of coronavirus was. We also don't think that it's over there, even though China has largely returned to work. There have been major changes. Most factories are not up to full capacity because if you recall, China let what they call their migrant workers go home for Chinese New Year. What they call a migrant worker is a worker that's been, that grew up in the countryside, was allowed to migrate to one of the big cities, the big manufacturing areas, because there was a job there. But they were never really allowed to be considered permanent residents, which, of course, in a command and control economy, they can send them home. They did that for the Beijing Olympics. They literally sent millions of people home, which is one of the reasons why the pollution during the Olympics in Beijing was the lowest it had ever been in many years. So they have not yet allowed everybody to move back into these jobs. So they're substantially back to work, but not fully back to work. In some industries and some companies, obviously more impacted from others. It is not business as usual. I don't know how well you can see this. I'm going to hold it up. But this is workers at a factory, and this is lunchtime, and they're maintaining social distancing. They're all eating lunch separately. So, literally set up space to be able to do that and be reasonably safe while doing that. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that China isn't certain that coronavirus is out of China. What it really tells me is they know it's not out of China, so they're still taking substantial precautions, which is just common sense. I can't, nobody should fault them for that. But it does mean that from a supply chain standpoint, you should not be counting on your supply chain being fully back to normal for some time yet. Maybe you're lucky, maybe that's all roaring again, but maybe it's not. And if it's not, you should not think that it's going to necessarily come back anytime soon. And we're going to talk about how to deal with that, toward the end of my prepared remarks. But China is, ultimately going to be able to get back into full swing. It's just a matter of time.
So John, I had heard last week that, at least according to one distributor in the Inland Empire, and he's well connected, so he's talking to others, that he thought they were back around 80% or so. Do you think that's about right at this point?
About right.
Okay.
Yep, that's about right.
But what I hear you saying is that it's not going to ramp up to 100% anytime soon due to social distancing, as well as the migrant workers and how that all works out. And of course it depends on who your suppliers actually are and whether they're prioritizing you.
Right. I mean, let's face it, China's a big country. Their internal supply chain is disrupted too. So, getting the parts from A place to B place and so on. Plus, like with the Apple iPhone example, literally parts come in from 26 countries, 52 countries, I don't remember which one, to China to be able to assemble and then ship out the finished iPhone product. So a lot of the import supply chains to China have also been affected by coronavirus, at least to some extent. So it's going to take a while to work through all of that. In the meantime, where are the other problem areas and where are the potential opportunity areas? Well, if you can get something produced in Iceland, you'd be in pretty good shape, or Singapore. or South Korea. They're all dealing with this pretty darn well, as is most of Europe. Spain and Italy being unfortunate, sad cases. But so far, the EU has been doing tolerably well with this. I expect India to be an absolute disaster. I just don't think that it's possible for India to do the kinds of sheltering in place and other kinds of things, social distancing. Just in the large cities, the people are so pushed together that the ability to keep this from seriously breaking out all over India, I would think, is between slim and none. And there were a lot of flights between Wuhan and India. That was one of the places where India and Pakistan, where there were quite a few regularly scheduled flights that were going on. So it's there. It's just a matter of how long it takes to break out in India.
I had heard.
And in the short run, India wasn't a replacement for the supply chain anyhow.
No, although there are a lot of clients that are looking at India, it seems, or are starting to source from there, so they're interested. Last I had heard, India was on a 21-day lockdown or something, and I don't remember. I think it has been extended. Is that correct? Do you know? Okay.
That's correct. Unfortunately, I just don't think that the lockdown can be as effective. It's like, we locked down New York City too late, but you're looking at how many people in such a small area. I can't get this to go to.
Yeah, don't
it's almost impossible to keep it from spreading. You can tamp it down somewhat, but and I think you're seeing signs that that's working in New York. But New York is an easier proposition than Mumbai.
Yeah, right.
By an order of magnitude, I think.
So you said South Korea and Singapore are both doing pretty well as far as
keep dealing with it pretty well.
How about Vietnam? Because a lot of folks are sourcing from Vietnam these days as well.
I had it up earlier. It doesn't look like there's been much in Vietnam yet. But virtually every country in the world, there's a coronavirus meter that you can pick up on with a quick Google search, and it's got a nice list of countries and what's been reported cases and confirmed cases and recovery cases and deaths. So that's a good monitor. Just recognize that there is a lag time to that. That is not uniform. So reporting is much faster from some countries than other countries. So it gives you a bit of a snapshot, but it's an uneven snapshot.
Well, do you think that, to your point, Vietnam hasn't had a lot of cases, but how prepared are they to handle this from a supply chain point of view?
They're not. Remember, it's a small country. There's a lot of tech savvy there now. But the infrastructure isn't there yet to rapidly grow. One of the biggest problems is that the banking system is still terrible. And so a company may get a big order, but it doesn't have the resources to do it on its own, goes and applies to the Vietnamese bank, and the bank is going to turn them down. Oh, you're going to have to wait your turn until we have enough reserve or liquidity to be able to make that loan. And so Vietnam is still some years away from being able to seriously challenge China in some areas, and India is even further away. So we just can't see that. I do think that places that among the tigers are pretty well situated to at least add capacity. South Korea, Malaysia to some extent, Indonesia to some extent in some areas, and this is an opportunity for them to devote resources to growing their infrastructure to be able to become more competitive with China. China knows it has competition out there, and now what we are seeing, and Lisa, I've been doing my Withered China seminar series for 7 years now, And I've been warning, to diversify out of sole sourcing in China. And you have all these other alternatives. The problem is those alternatives are not usually immediately available unless you're in an industry or space where that's already established in one of these other places. And of course, Mexico is your best bet in terms of so much capacity in so many different areas. Mexico is your nearshoring alternative to China. Just spoke about that last week with a couple of specialists, a lawyer and a maquiladora expert in Mexico. And we had a great time. I mean, they're the experts. I'm the lead-in. I'm like the introducer as a lawyer. It's like, look, you need to be looking at Mexico instead of China. Here are the things you need to be considering. Here are the people who can help you do it. And so Mexico, so far, isn't experiencing a severe breakout of coronavirus. It has to hit Mexico. And Obrador has been, basically more in denial about this. He's like the crazy jerk in Brazil. Oh no, we're not going to do anything. We don't have to do anything. And Brazilians, a wonderful people, are taking their own precautions. Creating their own solutions because they can read the papers, they can watch the news, and they think, no, we need to be doing something about this. And so same thing, our bigger businesses, our well-run businesses in Mexico have been taking steps to deal with this. So Mexico is a good alternative. It's probably the best alternative, and Canada as well. But there's only so much capacity in Canada. We forget it's a huge country geographically, but there are not that many people. Most of them live within 75 miles of the US border. And lest we forget, everybody who can afford to come to the United States when they need immediate health care, cross the border and get the health care over here, because the national healthcare system in Canada, as good as it is in so many ways, if you need something that's elective surgery, you might wait 9, 10, 12 months. And so if you can afford to come here, you can get it done in a month. So Canada's not really much of a choice. What about Russia? We have no idea what's going on in Russia relative to coronavirus. So we have no idea how accurate any of that is. But we do know that they have not turned on the spigot with respect to oil, despite the fact that they said they were going to do it. The Saudis immediately did it. They'll pay for that in some ways. Russia didn't do it, even though they said they were going to do it. Now, tentatively, they're back to the table to negotiate. So Russia, in so many ways, economically, other than the oil patch as a basket case, there's not much capacity there. And even if there were, I wouldn't recommend going there. That's just not a good alternative. So I mentioned Brazil. Brazil is a wonderful country, wonderful people, absolutely terrible regulatory and administrative practices that make setting up as a foreign company to do business in Brazil really, really difficult, very slow, very expensive. So to what extent can you rely on Brazilian companies to make stuff for you? And even there's a great deal of red tape because there's an export process that has to be done to be able to get the goods that you would prefer to have, perhaps a good Brazilian manufacturer make. Can they get it to you? Well, maybe not for months. So that's a problem. Brazil is not a solution. Argentina is a basket case economically. Argentina is not a good solution. Chile has been having some political problems of late. Chile is a pretty free economy, and there's a lot of good capacity down there, but not a good place right now simply because the politics have gotten a little weird in the last year or so, and there's some unrest. So that's not a good thing. Any other country you want me specifically to mention, Lisa? That
Good question. So if anybody has supply in any countries that we haven't mentioned so far that you'd like to learn more about, please send us a note through the Q&A section or the chat box. John, I think, our webinar speaker last week, I don't even know what day it is anymore. Today's Monday, isn't it? But anyway, last week was saying that he thought Mexico would gain from this whole coronavirus pandemic. Are you seeing that as well? And it sounds like we should jump on that opportunity, as well as, I think the US will gain too. But what are you seeing?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I want to talk about is we don't want to just hit the reset button on this. And one of the things that we should have learned, we better learn from this experience, is that globalization is a wonderful thing. It has lifted over 2 billion people out of poverty in the last 20 years. It has allowed us to allow our purchasing power dollars, which fueled this globalization, to buy a lot of stuff, including a lot of junk, but a lot of good stuff too, at very low prices, which means that even for our poorest folk here, the quality of life has improved. But we have allowed the pendulum to swing too much in favor of looking for efficiency and lowest cost producers at the expense of resiliency.
Right.
When you consider that, we've got 145 antibiotics, that 95% of them are made in China, exclusively or near exclusively, that's a dangerous thing. That's
Not
just
good.
a dangerous thing. Rare earths, and I know, Lisa, you've heard me talk about this one before. China threatened to cut off rare earths because they were mad at us about something in 2012, and the Pentagon went crazy, because we need rare earths in so much of what we need for our military capacity. So in 2018, the end of 2018, China threatened to cut them off again, and we had the same outburst from the Pentagon. 7 years on, you didn't do anything about it. We can mine rare earths here in this country. They exist here. We just have the NIMBY and other problems that keep that from happening. But a lack of resiliency, a lack of having the necessary capacity. We still have steelmaking capacity. We haven't been the lowest cost steel producer in a long time, but we are world-class in terms of certain kinds of specialty steels. So we have to be able to rejuvenate some of our manufacturing capacity. And we have to realize that you don't always need to have the lowest cost in order to be competitive. Germany has some of the highest manufacturing costs in the world, and it's a major exporting country. Why? Because their stuff is so good and everybody wants it. Even if the BMW 3 Series isn't as good in Car and Driver reviews as it once was, it's still an outstanding vehicle. So we have lost that ability to produce a lot of stuff. And at least with respect to anything that would bear on health and national security and some other critical needs, we should have that capacity here. And we need to create it. There's an opportunity, in my view, to start looking at bringing some of this stuff back, at least to have some capacity here. The other thing that this raises is we need to be focusing in our company about resilience, not just efficiency and lowest cost production. How are we going to be resilient? Or to use Taleb's word, which I like, how do we become anti-fragile? Fragile obviously is something that breaks, but when Taleb uses the term anti-fragile, he doesn't mean something that's just unbreakable. It means something that is more resilient, strong, able to withstand, able to bend. So more like a weed, because a weed can bend, it can take a shock when you step on it. And the next day, the weed is pretty much back in shape, ready to spread across your lawn. So we need to be looking at how we do that. And so I do want to talk about that in just a moment. But to get there, I want to talk about just a couple of things that we also want to do with our international supply chains. We need to be looking at our contracts. And remember, contracts allocate risks. So long as we've identified them, And then we've allocated risk. You take care of this, you're responsible for that. If this event occurs and there's a harm or loss, it's on your side, or this one might be a shared responsibility to deal with or handle the loss and so on. The more we think about the risk events, the better off that we are. And so when we just use form contracts or contracts that come off the internet or something like that, we may not have, even though we might have talked about these things with our counterparts, we didn't put them in the contract. So what happens when we don't put them in the contract? It means that when one of those risk events comes up, we may simply be stuck dealing with the loss of that. Or we might be able to sensibly use an indemnity clause. And I could talk for an hour about how stupid our usual indemnity clauses are, because usually one party, the party that has the greater bargaining power, is trying to lay everything off on the other side. You know, like in construction, the owner dumps everything on the general contractor. The general contractor dumps everything on the subcontractors, the ones least able to afford to pay. I mean, the dumbest example is, you know, the architect who might get a $15,000 design fee is asked to shoulder all the design risk for a $100 million building. Well, if something goes wrong with that building, the designer is out of business and doesn't even begin to cover that loss. So an indemnity clause that puts it all on the architect is just stupid. So if that kind of stuff is in your contract, you need to revisit it. Do you have a force majeure clause in your contract? And if you do, how good is it? Because most of them are crap. Again, these are little boilerplate things that are taken out that you know, they look good, they feel good, but probably didn't have epidemic or pandemic in it. Probably didn't cover thoroughly enough the possibility of a government-ordered shutdown or other impact on your supply chain. So you need to look at your force majeure clause. Most people don't look at that because it's a boilerplate clause. You know, the lawyers created that. The lawyers don't necessarily create them very well, because they just pull them out of form books and don't look at the specific circumstances. The same thing with commercial impracticability. That's a doctrine that the Uniform Commercial Code recognizes. The UN Convention for the International Sale of Goods recognizes as well, but in a somewhat different way. And how you invoke that, when and how you're able to invoke that successfully, is very different under both of those. And so it is commercially impracticable right now for a lot of companies to do business. But are they suspended from their performance obligations to others? Did they cover that in their contract? Probably not. So those are all things that now, especially if you have some extra time sheltering in place at home, you know, pull out your contracts, take a look at it, see what's in there, and look about modifying them to something better. Which brings me to the last part of my prepared remarks, and that is, you have the time right now to test your supply chain. You really need to test your supply chain, starting with who your counterpart is and how resilient they are. How able are they to weather the shocks that are currently going through our system globally? And if they're not, then what's your alternative supplier, and where is that supplier? You know, getting another manufacturer in China 3 miles down the road, they're likely to have the same shock problems. So they're not necessarily going to be your solution. So you really have to test all the aspects of your supply chain, identify them, and then identify all of the risks and potential choke points in your supply chain. And then say, let me see how good these are. You know, let me come up with all the possible things that could go wrong, and how my existing system might deal with that. You have to do the same thing, really, with your demand chain. You know, so how are you getting your goods to your customers? You know, what's it take to get there, and in what way is that impacted? Amazon, which is, you know, this powerhouse of a company, has on its own initiative, you know, stop next day delivery for everything except essential goods. Makes perfect sense, right? But if your customers are used to getting your stuff next day because you are using Amazon fulfillment, they're unhappy. Are they unhappy with Amazon, or are they unhappy with you? Who are they blaming? You know, so you've got to look at all the potential risk areas and choke points on your demand side as well. So I'm going to give you a really interesting way of doing that, but you can't do this one all by yourself. In fact, you're best doing it by using somebody completely outside your organization. And that is to red cell your supply chain. Now, what does that term mean? Red cell is a military planning term. It means that you create a group of people who have been brought together. They're experts. You bring them together for the sole purpose of devising ways to attack your business. How many ways can I attack your business? How can I cripple or destroy your business? And that's their sole job. Their job is not even to think about how you might be able to defend or how they could recommend to you how to defend. A pure red cell, which might have one person necessary at the beginning to be briefing your experts about everything having to do with your company. They otherwise stay out of it. And then you create a blue cell. The blue cell is your planning group that is then prepared to anticipate and protect your business. And then your blue cell will take the attack scenarios when they're finally given to you from your red cell group, and they will say, we have to be able to prepare to defend you against these possible things. It's a little bit expensive. Obviously, you can do miniature versions of this if you're a smaller company to at least get a flavor of this, but a mid-sized to a large organization, can certainly do a pretty much full-bore version of this, and that's your strongest possible way of getting prepared for the things that can go wrong. So that brings me to my last thought, which I've given to you in a couple of different ways, and this is my end thought. We'll take questions. Is don't just hit the reset button when things get back to normal. You have an opportunity to do things better. So take advantage of the opportunity and make your company stronger. If you're a consultant, push that idea on your clients and offer to help in your area of expertise in any way you can.
All right, so on this, it seems like the concept you were talking about with the red cells and the blue cells, really you could just break your business into some teams, right? And just have one that's thinking about what could go wrong and what might you come up against, right? So and the other one is navigating the current situation. And then I guess, I don't know if you mentioned this, but is there one that's also like thinking about how to emerge from this successfully, basically, in a way that's growing?
Right. Yeah, you can definitely do a version of red cell, blue cell internally. But in military planning, you're using external resources to do that. So you're avoiding the cross-contamination possibility. With Chinese walls, especially the small business, really hard to maintain.
Got it.
But yeah, you can do versions of this.
I see. But the concept is a good idea, certainly. So we did have a question about Eastern Europe. If you wanted to comment on how they're, like, how prepared they are to handle this, because like you said, I mean, coronavirus can obviously affect every country to some degree, some worse than others. But if we have supply in these places, how worried should we be?
It depends on which country. Hungary, of course, has a very nationalistic government, has really hunkered down. It's really closing the borders. We saw that with immigration and refugee-related issues. They're basically violating EU directives about free flow of people across borders. Of course, in time of crisis like this, you end up doing restrictions even when you're supposed to have open borders. We're seeing this here in the United States. Rhode Island police were sending anybody with a New York license trying to turn around and sending them back.
Right.
That's not legal. Arguably not legal under federal constitution, but in a time of emergency, government puts an order about sheltering in place. You see someone driving through with out-of-state license plates. Yeah, I think the police have a constitutional ability to pull them over anyhow, if not necessarily send them back. So we're seeing that in some of the countries in Eastern Europe. Poland seems to be pretty strong. I don't have any information on most of the rest of the Eastern European countries, but I can see what I can find out for you on that.
Okay, yeah. So if you have any specific countries, just let us know within that if we haven't already addressed it. So it sounds like, in summary, what I'm gaining here is that one, our supply chain is definitely completely disrupted around the globe, but to varying degrees. It sounds like China's back on board to around 80%. However, they may not get back to that 100% anytime soon because of the migrant workers and the new bouts, if you will, of coronavirus and social distancing that they're going to have to do. Sounds like South Korea and Singapore are some good options, as well as potentially Malaysia and Indonesia to some degree, from what you were saying. Vietnam, well, they haven't had too many instances yet, but they are not necessarily as prepared from a infrastructure standpoint. In India, you're really concerned about from an infrastructure standpoint, it sounds like.
Right.
And I think your point is very well, very extremely valid here. Is when things start back up, we shouldn't just hit the reset button. We should be really thinking about what we do in our supply chain, where our supply is, do we have backup supply, all those kinds of questions that you were asking or that you were suggesting. So that seems like a great idea. Oh, and by the way, he brought up Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. So I don't know if you know anything about them, or if maybe you can, just get back to us and let us know afterwards. That'd be great.
I'll see what I can find.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Does anybody else have any questions about the global supply chain? Are you seeing? I guess the other question that comes to mind here is: are you seeing countries thinking more about trying to work with other? Are they being more collaborative right now, or are they more worried about their internal issues? Like, what do you think from that point of view?
I think the first reaction is internal. You kind of hunker down.
Right.
But we can't solve these problems by ourselves. And of course, that's where China has now, there's this big public relations campaign. Since we've been so successful in solving our problem, we're here to help you. And in fact, the capacity to produce from real companies whose products are already registered here in the United States with FDA or NIOSH, they're back in production. They have stuff that China now says, we've got this available for export, we're open for business. That's perfectly fine. That's a good thing. They also have a lot of fly-by-night operators that are trying to take advantage of it right now. And so they make a paper product. Now they're trying to learn how to make a mask. I wouldn't touch those. Even if they don't need to be medical quality, you don't want to bring in stuff like that. So, know your counterpart is my number one principle of how to protect yourself in making good contracts. By the way, I do a webinar on how to make great contracts with my 9 principles. That's number one, is know who you're doing business with. Don't buy from strangers, and don't buy from fraudsters who manage to make themselves look like something they aren't.
Well, that's a good point. So I guess that was the other thing I didn't mention in my thinking of recap, is know your counterpart in the contracts piece. So that's a really good point. We do have another question here. Is low demand a potential long-term disruptor to the supply chain, especially in China?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the message that we are going to be sending on a rather regular basis to China, is that it's not going to be business as usual anymore. Companies that have a lot of resources have been steadily planning and in some cases already executing, moving some of their supply anyhow out of China. And that's a good thing for our companies to be able to do. We should be diversified. We do not want to make an enemy out of China. We're too interconnected, and they do a lot of great stuff. And the Chinese people are wonderful. It's their government that sucks. The Communist Party sucks. And they treat their people horribly. And they treat the rest of the world horribly too sometimes. But remember, we're talking about 1.3 billion people. There are 100 million members of the Communist Party in China. So we have to put that in context. It kind of goes back to your question of we first deal internally with our issues, and then we try to cooperate globally. We've certainly had instances in our current administration where we're not playing nice in the sandbox, even with some of our friends. But unfortunately, it doesn't matter who's in office. The United States has a rather erratic history of how we behave toward even some of our friends. Our European friends, the joke is, the United States idea of a long-term foreign policy is about 3 weeks. and here's a continent where things that were put in place after the Napoleonic Wars are still part of the base by which European countries try to get along with each other. Some of the underlying features of what became the EU, and some of the things that came after the German reunification under Bismarck. And we think of Bismarck, we tend to think of this stern authoritarian bad guy. But Bismarck did Germany this enormous favor of taking all these little factions and warring little feudal type of places and created a real country out of it. And of course, we saw some bad nationalistic things happen as a result of that later. But we also forget that Bismarck, for Germany, created the first national healthcare system in the 1870s, and it's world class. It has been cradle to grave coverage since the 1870s, and it works. We can learn a few lessons from that. If we were to ever to go in that model, we should at least do it the right way.
Right, right. Well, thank you, John. This has been quite informative. I think that our goal at Apex Inland Empire and also LMA Consulting Group is to try to keep folks aware and in the loop of what's really happening so that you can make good decisions and start to be proactive, because just wallowing in our situation is by no means going to set us up for success as far as where we go from here. It's actually a really critical time. The people who tend to look at and be proactive and invest even during like the Great Depression and the Great Recession, were far more successful than their counterparts. So now is the time to be rethinking your supply chain. Don't wait until we're ready to come out of this, which you never know. Hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later. So anyway, thank you very much, John, for that. And I wanted to alert everyone to our next webinar in our Navigating Through Volatility webinar series on April 10th. We have David Porter, who's going to talk about COVID-19 impact on freight flows and supply chain hiring activities. So this is, it's really actually a challenging topic because a lot of our transportation assets are all in the wrong places right now. So what are we doing about that, and how will we even be able to find drivers? So he's going to give us an update on where that stands. And while I was on this webinar today, I was able to find out or confirm that we're going to add 2 webinars into our series.